Vision podcast. Your host, Derek Lambert. Dr. Luther G. Williams is still getting that book ready, guys. Get ready, because when it comes out, I know you guys are going to show him some love and buy the book. And we have a special guest. I want to dig right into this. You guys want me to shorten up what I do in the intros? Well, that's fine. We're going to start jumping right into this. I have Reverend C.H. Lawson, and some of you on Facebook know him as Christopher Lawson. He's going to be bringing a totally interesting view on Jesus that you don't hear anywhere else, that I haven't heard anywhere else. And he's going to delve into very interesting topics. Christopher, if you don't mind, could you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about things you've had, people you've interacted, maybe a little bio even, if you don't mind.
Well, fine. I'll read about the author on my Reconstructing Jesus from the back page. It's in the third person, so I'll be referring to myself in the third person. C.H. Lawson is a retired elementary school principal who received his certificate of teaching in 1979, endorsed for Bible, and endorsed for elementary grades, all subjects. Prior to graduate studies in elementary education and psychology at Andrews University Graduate School, he studied pre-medical at McMaster University. He received his BA in theology from Atlantic Union College, taking multiple minors in the biblical languages, classical Hebrew, Aramaic, Koine Greek, textual criticism. From 1980 to 1995, he authored an unpublished study that details the history of the Nazarene community at Qumran, well known for its association with the famous Dead Sea Scrolls, called For Christ's Sake, the Messianic Movement of the First Century in the Light of the Dead Sea Scrolls. In 2010, he was called as an expert witness in an important constitutional challenge brought by the Church of the Universe in the Superior Court of Justice in Toronto, Ontario. He provided the court with historical, archaeological, linguistic, and theological evidence. He specifically explained the historical influence of entheogenic mystery rituals from diverse cultures and religions of antiquity and their complex impact on the development of early Judaism, intertestamental Judaism, including the Dead Sea Scroll community, and early Christianity. Dr. Carl A. P. Ruck, professor of classical studies at Boston University, the world's foremost authority on ancient mystery religions and author of graduate textbooks on advanced Greek, was also called as an expert witness. His review of Lawson's lengthy written submission, a clearly written, comprehensive presentation of the evidence. And Dr. Ruck was kind enough to actually add a blurb for the cover of my book. He said, quote, "Reconstructing Jesus applies the simplest of methods for investigating the sources for an historical account and comes up with a very plausible documentation of the Jesus event as mythologized history, whose actual happening makes much better sense. This essay will explain why there was so much fuss and obfuscation about the Dead Sea Scrolls, and why the subject is still too hot to handle. Anyone who does not wish to think should avoid this like the plague," end quote. Thank you, Carl, for that one. Okay, do you have a question, or do you want me to just get into it?
I say we go into the deep end. I just want to say you covered a lot of stuff there, so you guys might have to play that back to hear some of the credentials and some of the things that you've been involved in. So please, what's the question centered around other than who is Jesus? I mean, for crying out loud, wars and I mean, for 2,000 years we've had this religion, start to take over and control and battle against other religions. And to this day, we scratch our heads and go, well, is it Bart Ehrman's Jesus? Is it mythicism? What are you bringing to the table?
Well, I think everybody that you mentioned has a little bit to offer. I agree with Ehrman that there's an historical root. I agree with Carrier that there's been all sorts of mythologization that's occurred. What I do not appreciate about Carrier is that he has ignored the most important sources in his research. You do not hear, except a few occasional snippets in this few small endnotes or footnotes, about the Dead Sea Scrolls' role in his analysis. And one of the foremost Scrolls researchers, Robert Eisenman, whom I profoundly respect because of the evidence that he brings to the table, his evidence is not considered at all by Carrier. You can't find a single reference to Eisenman anywhere in Carrier's work. That is a serious flaw for Carrier, and he loses all credibility in my book on that count alone.
If you don't mind me pausing right there, because I think that's an important point. There's been a lot of scholars who suggest Eisenman's dating is wrong, okay? Regardless, though, the textual evidence, regardless of what you want to do with carbon dating, the textual evidence is what you're trying to appeal here, right? I mean,
yes, the textual evidence, and there's a lot of evidence within the scrolls about the dating. So what we really need to talk about is why people have a misconception about the dating of the scrolls. There was intentional misdirection put out about the scrolls by the people who had control of the scrolls. The international team was predominantly a Roman Catholic operation, with the exception of John Allegro, who opposed the Catholic team's conceptions and understanding of what was in the scrolls. Allegro was saying when the truth about the scrolls came out, it would be the demise of the Roman Catholic Church. So keep that in mind. And also consider that Allegro was by far, by orders of magnitude, the most superior linguist in that entire international team of Dead Sea Scrolls scholars. So he really carries a lot of weight. And by fluke of circumstance, he got assigned some of the key scrolls that are very, very revealing. So that worked out against the Catholic Church's interest in that way.
So to be fair to Carrier, if you don't mind me bringing this up, or what fairness is the same way Carrier recognizes something fishy is going on with the early church fathers and Eusebius, and possibly with this insertion of the Testimonium Flavinium and stuff. Just as much as there's something going on there, you're suggesting something's going on here, and they're not even paying attention to the very same argument that they're using for early church and all this stuff right here under our nose within this century or within the past century.
Absolutely. The leading scroll scout, the guy who was in charge of that team was Cardinal Ratzinger, who also at the same time he was in charge of the scroll research, held the office of the head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. That is the new Catholic name for what in the Middle Ages was called the Grand Inquisitor, the Inquisitor General. So Ratzinger had the Inquisitor General position in the Catholic Church, whose job is to keep the faithful flock adhering to the traditions of the church. That's important. That's his primary role. And he had that role in hand the entire time. And in my opinion, it was his obfuscation of the Dead Sea Scroll research that got him put into the position where he became Pope Benedict.
Interesting. So what's the Dead Sea Scrolls have to do with Jesus? I mean,
That's a good question. When the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, the first of them were discovered in the Cave 1 Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in 1948, revealed 7 different documents. And we had a sample of one of them. The Damascus document, we already had a sample from the Cairo Geniza in Egypt. And so we had hints about it. These documents are extraordinary documents. For example, the Damascus document ends with an extraordinary statement. It says, "And they will see his salvation because they trusted in his holy name." And that's the end line of the document. But when you realize that the Hebrew there is, they will see his salvation, the Hebrew there is Yeshua. They will see Yeshua because they trusted in his holy name. And now they didn't give away names unless they could do double entendre and little tricks like that in the scrolls. Otherwise, no one was named for security purposes. This sect was very xenophobic. So the Dead Sea Scrolls do have a very interesting picture of the sects in Judaism. Now, people have said that they were 2nd century BC. Who said that? The Catholics. The Catholics have an axe to grind. What was their evidence for saying 2nd century BC? They came up with what they call paleographical data, but they were comparing one Dead Sea Scroll with another and guessing, how many variations are in this one in the lettering for this, and they were coming up with all sorts of weird mixes, and they were arguing with each other on how to place them together because the whole thing was a big artificial mix, and that's not how you do paleography. To properly do paleography, you need to have control scrolls that are properly dated by some other method that you already know are reliable, whether there's dates within the scrolls or whether the scrolls are found sandwiched between datable layers or things like that, or some other evidence internal from other scrolls that you know the certain dates and you compare that handwriting to the others. Now, at best, it's a bit of vague guessing anyways, because especially in view of the Dead Sea Scroll community revered ancient writing techniques. And we know this when you look at the Temple Scroll, they used Paleo-Hebrew whenever they came across the divine name Yahweh. They wrote that in Paleo-Hebrew letters, where the rest of it was written in Aramaic square script. So they obviously revered ancient writing techniques. So to say that they can tell this writing is from this period or that period is a very, very weak way of doing it, and especially when there's no comparable scrolls to use as a control, and that's essential. you have to have a whole volume of scrolls. And I'm going to quote G.R. Driver from the foreword to one of DeVoe's, one of the leaders of the International Teams Research. And Driver says, quote, "No written Jewish works, other than a few inscriptions on tombs and odd papyrus and so on, survive in their original Hebrew form between the book of Daniel and the Mishnah. All that is extant of Jewish literature is in translation," end quote. So they don't have any writings from the 2nd century BC, 1st century BC, to compare them to. So they can't say the paleography proves it 2nd century BC. That's just absolute nonsense. Furthermore, many different scholars have looked at the scrolls and assumed a 1st century provenance. I'm just looking for a piece in my document to pull up the reference there.
Yeah, please do.
First of all, I'll mention that Barbara Thiering, who's got some really crazy theories about the Jesus story. I shouldn't say crazy, but hard to accept, and most scholars don't. But she does recognize a 1st century pattern of Pesherim commentary style in the Dead Sea Scrolls and in the New Testament. So that indicates a 1st century thing there. Yigael Yadin recognized 1st century comparisons between the War Scroll and 1st century Roman armor military manuals. Andre Dupont Summer concurred on that. And let's see, I'm doing this from memory because I couldn't find the quote I wanted. Also, Cecil Roth and G.R. Driver both recognized the historical elements and descriptions to match the zealots of the 1st century in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So there are many reasons for thinking 1st century for the Dead Sea Scrolls, but there's a lot more.
Right.
One of the key things is the internal evidence itself. The Dead Sea Scrolls have parables, and that's something that's very unusual. It used to be a criticism of the Gospels to say that this Jesus had to be made up because there weren't any parables until the rabbinic period of this format, and to say that Jesus was running around saying rabbinic style parables, that seems like that's evidence that it's made up. But then all of a sudden we come to the Dead Sea Scrolls and we find parables all over the place, and that's an indication that these can't be 2nd century BC. If they were having a complaint about the veracity of the New Testament story by saying the parables, how do you push them back to 1st century instead of 2nd century, or at least late 1st century? If you're having trouble pushing them back to Jesus' time, how in the world can you justify pushing them back 2 centuries earlier still? So that just
good point.
So that just doesn't make sense at all. Furthermore, the Dead Sea Scrolls match the teachings of Judah the Galilean. If you read the descriptions in Wars of the Jews and descriptions in Antiquities from Josephus of what Judah taught, and compare it to the teachings in the scrolls, you'll see that the sectarian scrolls from Qumran match Judah's teachings. And we know Judah was 1st century, that he met his demise in 6 CE after the tax revolt. And this is part of it, the story. To understand the chronology of the Jesus story will help you put the pieces together a little easier. First of all, I want to suggest my main methodology in approaching the Jesus story. I basically wanted to find what little piece of the story can I find that might be true or it might be testable. And I came up with the idea of the repeated theme of royalty. If Jesus was the heir to the throne, that would make sense of his messianic claim. Isaiah 66, very, very clear, the Messiah is going to be a conquering king. In fact, that chapter in the Isaiah scroll from Qumran had an X mark beside it. So they really, really believed in that. So the idea of calling Jesus Mashiach, or our word Messiah, means he's the anointed king. To call him Christos in Greek, our word Christ, again, means anointed king. The idea that he was competition for King Herod. Herod was nervous, who's this other king guy? To say that there was a star uh, story associated with his birth, whether it's a legend or a myth or not. Just that it's associated with his birth brings in Numbers 24 and the Balaam prophecy, and the idea that there will be this special king. And what's that king going to do? Well, he's going to conquer. He's going to be a scepter over the whole planet. They definitely believed in a physical, vigorous, messianic king, but they were smart about it. They were planning ahead. They were not taking any chances with a more powerful force. They looked at Jeremiah's promise to say there shall always be a king over Israel, and they took it as a command and a promise, and they had an alternative king ready to fight the Romans. They had an alternative high priest ready to replace the one appointed by the Romans. The Roman appointees got their position because they were sucking up to the Romans and they were pushing Roman agenda, or they had simply paid off the Romans to get that position. So when you get a position as sensitive as a high priest or the king of the country up for sale, you can expect that the people who are going to be the most conservative and the most traditional of the Jewish people are going to respond the most vigorously. And this has led the Jews to have what was called a Zealot Movement. Now, the Zealot Movement has been misrepresented as being criminal in the New Testament. A typical slander. Everything in the New Testament is a twist on the original story, because the New Testament is the later story, the Romanized story.
Right.
So Jesus is mocked by the Romans, and one of the things they mock the most is his royalty. So when he's crucified, he's got a crown of thorns. He's got a robe that they make him wear and whip him. They crucify him. Crucifixion was a political punishment. They put a sign over the cross. There's 3 different versions of the sign, and since it was something that's supposed to be written down, you would think they'd be identical, but they're not. The only thing they have in common is Jesus is the king. In the trial of Jesus in Mark, it's 15 verses long, but it mentions King of the Jews 6 times. So the theme of the king makes sense, and that he's going to come back as the messianic king and restore the kingdom of David, all these things, and the songs, Hosanna, son of David, all these things say king, 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 king. Well, a king is a multicultural concept. It's something we can understand even if we're not born as a Jew. We can understand the concept of a king. And we have examples of monarchies existing today. We know how they work. And if you want to know who Jesus's father was, well, if the king story has any credibility, then his father had to be the previous king. That's how monarchies work. So if you go to England today and you ask, who is the queen? Everybody knows. Pick up a dollar bill or a coin or a stamp, you know the queen's face. You want to know who the previous queen was or previous king? Again, look at the coins. Everybody knows who the next one's going to be. He hasn't been crowned yet, but you already know who's in line. So the same would be true of Jesus. Everybody would know he's the guy in line. And they used a special name for this guy. He was the branch of David. And so they used the term the branch in the Dead Sea Scrolls to speak of him. And the Dead Sea Scrolls describe a group that matched the Jesus story. They believe in angels. They believe in resurrection. So we can rule out it being the Sadducees. All right, these people are politically hostile to the Romans to the point of xenophobia. So we can rule out the Pharisees. They refer to the Pharisees as seekers after smooth things in the Dead Sea Scrolls. They didn't like them. So we can rule them out. So Josephus told us that the Jews were divided into basically 3 sects. Then elsewhere, he describes them as being described in 4 sects, breaking one down into having a more radical group. And it is that 3rd sect, the Essene group, that our group from Qumran comes from. And when you understand what the names of the sects mean, it also helps us to make the right identification. And people say, well, wait a minute, there are so many sects. There are minim all over the place, people will say. Well, that's true after the Roman destruction and the scattering and the diaspora. That's true then, but it was not true before the Roman destruction. Josephus is very clear. It's 3, or at best you can count it into 4 sects, and that's all. Well,
So it's fair to say, if you don't mind, because I don't want to interrupt where you're headed, it's fair to say the earliest movement was Israel only.
yes, exactly. And Matthew preserves that idea. Jesus telling the disciples, go only amongst the cities of Israel, and before you've gone all the cities of Israel, the Son of Man will already have returned. And here's that theme of a short period of time when there'll be a gap and then there'll be a return. And the Dead Sea Scrolls have that expectation of one of their teachers of righteousness that they called the unique teacher. Now, there were a series of these teachers, and one of the teachers, the teacher that took over after Jesus, we know that the Jesus movement was taken over by his brother James. The Gospel of Thomas predicted that. There's a saying there that says, the disciples came to Jesus and asked him, after you, who should we seek? And said, well, wherever you are, go to James the righteous. For his sake, heaven and earth were born. And so he's saying James is the guy. And the church fathers, Eusebius and others, all say, yeah, James took over afterwards. It fits. James was even said to have such recognition of respect amongst all the other rabbis that apparently in 62 CE, they pleaded with him to calm the crowds, because in 62 CE, there was some kind of expectation that related to Jesus as the Messiah, and it was supposed to be happening soon. So when you combine these things, and the fact that the Dead Sea Scrolls say their teacher of righteousness, this unique teacher, they expected him to resurrect. Now, that's another thing. Resurrection is a big, big deal. But this resurrection is not a Greco-Roman style resurrection or that kind of expectation. The Greco-Roman expectation is typically 3 days, like Mithras. But this was a Jewish group, purely Jewish, very devout Jewish. They were reenacting the Exodus. That's a 40-year wait. So they expected there to be a 40-year wait from the teacher of righteousness and his death to the time when he would come back in glory. And this helps us date the scrolls, because obviously you don't write that in the scrolls if you've already been disappointed and the time has already passed. And you don't write it as something future ahead. It just doesn't make sense any other way but that the Dead Sea Scrolls were written after the death of Jesus and before the time when he was supposed to resurrect. This 40-year wait, reenacting of the Exodus, is supposed to end the same way that the Exodus ended. The Exodus ended with a Joshua figure taking control of the promised land. Well, Joshua is the Hebrew way of saying the Aramaic Yeshua. Yahashua, Yeshua, same name. Both mean salvation. And that's Jesus' personal name. So Jesus fits as a Joshua redivivus. They expect him to come back in 40 years. If you look at Judah the Galilean as being Jesus' father, then it makes sense of a whole lot of our things. All of a sudden it has explanatory power. Judah was called the Galilean. All of a sudden we have a sense of why the name the Galilean got stuck to Jesus. People say, well, didn't that get stuck to Jesus because he was born in Nazareth? No, that's part of the misinformation that the New Testament tried to put out. Nazarene has nothing to do with Nazareth. Never did. Not the same thing at all. And
that's what I thought. I thought that as well, that it was maybe a later attachment to that locality, based on this Nazarene concept.
Yeah, based on a sound-alike word and the fact that they were dealing with Gentiles who knew nothing about the Hebrew meanings of the names of the various sects. So if you were a Pharisee, it was because you were separated from the word Peraz. If you were a Sadducee, it means you thought you were righteous from the word Zadok, or you thought you were an heir to the righteous priesthood of the sons of Zadok that were preached about in the book of Ezekiel for the restored temple, and that's also spelled Zadok. So Zadokim, either that way or through being righteous ones, Zadokim. And then the Essenes, they were doers of the law. You were an Essene, you were Asea HaTorah. The collective plural is Asim. We've Grecoized that to Essene. If you were a Nazarene, you were a guardian, or as in a keeper, a jail keeper type of keeper. You were a protector of the covenant. The collective plural is Nazarene Habri. So Nazarene is where that name came from. Jesus was known as the Nazarene, which may well mean, of course, that he would be the leader. So it all makes perfect sense. They even describe their sectarian names, and sectarian names are important. Now, just to be sure that we got the right sect, this sect also believed in the Holy Spirit. All throughout the scrolls, you hear about Ruach Kodesh, and this over and over again. So no other sect of Jews use that name over and over and over again. There are a few other sectarian references where they use it in an articulated form, which is a little bit different linguistically than the way the Dead Sea Scrolls did it. It has no significant meaning linguistically, that difference, but it is a marker that identifies the way this sect wrote their name as distinctive from the others. And the fact that in 300, 400 years of all the other sects, you can only find maybe half a dozen references to Ruach Kodesh. But yet, in only a 10-year period or a 30-year period at most in the Dead Sea Scrolls, you're talking about hundreds, if not thousands, of references to Ruach Kodesh. It states like all of a sudden this was a sectarian theme song. So we've got the right sect. There's no way we can be missing our mark on this. And this sect, they had a sacred meal of bread and wine, just like the Christians. There's so many things that fit exactly. But back to the timing. Jesus allegedly had some sort of star story related to his birth. It is entirely possible that there was a celestial event that was timed with the birth of the historical Jesus. Now, there is a triple conjunction of the three slowest wanderers that occurred in 7 BC. That is very interesting. The wanderers are the Earth, are the planets in the solar system, but they didn't know they were planets. They thought they were special stars. All the other stars in the sky end up in the constellation that you find them in, and they stay in that constellation, and if that part of the sky revolves around out of sight, those stars go with it. They're never up in any other constellation. But the wanderers, they could have any constellation at all in the background and show up just any old place. So they were very, very special, and they were considered to be extra powerful deities because of this extra free will that they got that the other stars didn't. And the ancients would have noticed that the wanderers had grouped together. If they got close to each other within the distance of the width of the moon in the sky, they called it a conjunction. Now in 7 BC, the three slowest wanderers conjuncted together. Now that's significant. The fastest wanderers, of course, are Mercury and Venus because they're closest to the sun, so they have a much faster orbit around the sun. But Mars and Jupiter and Saturn that conjuncted together in 7 BC, they are over 2,300 times less frequent of a conjunction than the other kind. So this would have been very, very significant. Now, furthermore, Babylonian tablets have preserved for us that the Babylonians took note of these conjunctions, and that when these three slowest wanderers gathered together, they considered it to be the birth of a king. And the tablets from Babylon also tell us that they paid attention to what zodiac sign, they called it the Mazzaroth, was in the background when this conjunction occurred. Because as we mentioned earlier, they could show up anywhere in the sky. And they assigned one of their neighboring nations to each of these signs of the zodiac. And they assigned the background for the 7 BC conjunction was the constellation Pisces. And the Babylonian tablets assigned Pisces to Judea. So 7 BC, we have all the indications that an ancient astrologer, and we have the story that it was ancient astrologers from Babylon who noticed this. It fits the Bible story to say that it was these guys who were saying, hey, something special is happening here. Now, the rest of the story, the slaughter of the innocents, that's all nonsense. That didn't happen historically. There's no way that a Roman appointee king, puppet king, would be taking those kinds of doing that kind of behavior under Roman control. He's so far from the edge, the center of the kingdom, it was hard to patrol. There's no way he'd be stirring up that kind of storm in a province already hard to handle. So that's mythical, the slaughter of the innocents. But the concept of the age of the targets in the story tell us what some of the history might be. Even if they're making up the story is based on history in historical context of timing. And they said the timing was you had to get the children 2 years old or younger. Well, Herod died in 4 BC. So and so we don't go to the 0 BC thing for Jesus' birth, because we know the whole BC AD thing, or BCE, and if you want to do it that way, before Christian era, was developed by St. Francis Xavius in 600 roughly AD. And it was his best guess. The 0 mark was just his best guess for when it would be. And he did a darn good job. We actually have to give that guy credit, because he was only off by a handful of years. But we know Herod died 4 BC, and Jesus had to be born before Herod died to have any of the story make sense. So he had to be born before 4 BC. If you take note that Herod didn't entertain any guests in his last year of existence, because he had a groin infection that eventually got so infected that that's what killed him. So for his last year, he had no visitors. So you have to add 1 year there, and then you add the 2 years, the age of the children, you got 7 BC, and it exactly matches up with the astrological event. So it does make sense that there was a root core, and it wasn't just the Balaam prophecy of Numbers 24 alone. But even if it was just the Balaam prophecy, the very fact that they're applying this prophecy to Jesus, the star idea to Jesus, shows that they thought of him as king. Now, if you take 7 BC as Jesus' birth date, and you say that Judas the Galilean was Jesus' father, then when Judas the Galilean died in 6 CE, Jesus would be 12 years old. That exactly matches the only mention of Jesus in the New Testament as a child. That he says, "No, you're not. I must be about my Father's business." And he's saying this right at 12 years old. And it seems that there is something special happened to Jesus at 12 that was worthy of mention, but has been garbled because it wasn't in the interest of the New Testament to let the clear story come out. And one of the things that we know got garbled about the Jesus story is the anointing. He's called the Anointed One, the Messiah, left, right, and center. Christ, 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 this, Christ, that, Christ, everything. Every other page has Christ 20 times. So why can you call this guy the Anointed One and never, ever tell us the story of his anointing? How does that work? Why don't they tell us about the anointing? Apparently, if Jesus was the king, he would have had to be the son of the previous king. That would make him the son of Judah. So at 12 years old, he was anointed king. But they couldn't let him go public because he didn't have a son yet. And they had that rule. You can't let your last king go because he has to have an heir before you risk him. You must always have a king. Don't take any risk with him. So away Jesus goes for a 20-year hiatus. And the Dead Sea Scrolls talk about that time period precisely. They say that the arrival of their unique teacher, the one that I suggest is the historical Jesus, they say that the sect was wandering in like blind men in the wilderness, and God saw that they were searching with a pure heart, and he sent them a teacher of righteousness who showed them the way, using the very word derek, which is the equivalent of the Greek hodos, the word way as in the path or the road, not way as in method.
Am I the anointed?
Pardon me?
I said, am I the anointed now?
No. He's going to show them the way. Yeah, but you've got a very noble name. It's got a lot of history behind it there. The Hebrew derek means the way, the Aramaic darshi, and the Greek hodos, all the same word. So the Dead Sea Scrolls then say it was 20-year period before their teacher of righteousness went out public. And if Judas the Galilean died in 6 CE, well, he did die in 6 CE. If he was the period at when the sects began their wandering because their leader was dead and the new leader was only 12, then that explains it. It starts at 6 CE. 20 years later is 26 CE. Now, 26 CE, if Jesus was born in 7 BCE, and remember there's no year 0 when St. Francis Xavius made this up, the math works out that Jesus would be 32 years old in 26 CE when he started his public ministry. This matches what Luke 3:23 says. Jesus was about 30. That makes sense if he was 32. He had to be at least 30 to be acknowledged as a rabbi. Some say older than that, but at least 30 anyways. So that makes perfect sense. Everything again fits. Now, the Dead Sea Scrolls say that this teacher that he died, and they expected him to resurrect. And again, the 40-year waiting period, they said that he would resurrect right at the time of a great war against the Jews against the Kittim. The Kittim was their name for the Romans. So the Jews were the ones who did the timing on the war. It wasn't like the timing was forced on them. The timing for the war started when the lower priesthood suspended all sacrifices on behalf of the emperor. And this lower priesthood was trained at Qumran, the Dead Sea Scroll community. So, in fact, the Dead Sea Scroll community had been running drills with this priesthood on how to do military commands. The War of the Scrolls of the Sun's Light talk about all the signals and the trumpet calls and everything for how the troops are going to be directed. And the priests would be the generals and the captains and the lieutenants of this kind of a war. So the priesthood was intricately involved in the planning for the war against Rome, and they set the timing for when it was all to occur.
So technically, if you don't mind me kind of like on that note, because I know you're going somewhere good with this, right? The idea of prophecy or predicting, it's like modern politicians that are Zionist, right? Exactly. They think they're forcing the hand for the prophecy to be fulfilled kind of idea. That's what you're saying here is going on, and that's why predictions could be made.
Yes, that's not only why predictions could be made, but it's also why we can do our calculation of the dates in the history in reverse, because they were in control of the dates. These weren't accidental timings forced on them. These were timings they were forcing on the Romans themselves. So when we know that this is a sect that did the timing and that controlled what the priesthood was being taught, then we can say, well, the Dead Sea Scrolls tell us that this righteous teacher died 40 years before he was expected to win the war for them. Well, that war came to a climax in 70 CE, and if the righteous teacher was crucified 40 years before that, then we now have a date for the crucifixion of the righteous teacher, and it's 30 CE, and it matches the Jesus story again. You see, so the timing works out completely. Now, and it explains why all these disturbances with Crestus and other things and Jews in Rome, the Jews being a reference for their interpretation of the Christians, they would have looked upon them as Jews, and these all make perfect sense that there are still machinations happening. The Romans knew that this messianic story was a powerful, powerful story, and it was helping the Jews to win the war. There was a period later on when Bar Kokhba revolt used the same messianic idea, and it empowered the Jews to clear out the Romans out of Palestine for about 5 years. So the idea of a messianic figure was very, very important as a piece of military propaganda to give them hope that they could win against the Romans. And the Romans had to rewrite that mythology in order to take that power away from them, because they knew that we may crush them now, but if they're believers in the story, they're going to rise again and again and again unless we change the story.
Very interesting, because this ties in to so many of my guests that have come on. Everyone is different. Every single one of you guys brings something different, but this is what Myth Vision's all about. So they can go ahead and realize we're going to bring a variety of different ideas. I really enjoy this. So Jesus is the son of Judas the Galilean that you're talking about.
Yes, and I prefer to call him Judah the Galilean, because the name Judah is noble. It's the name of a tribe. It's the name of a patriarch. It's the name of a country. Whereas Judas is the name of a Greco-Romanized hodgepodge that is supposedly traitorous.
Ah, okay.
So you see, now again, the putting down thing, the name Judah, which would be Jesus's father's name. And if the Talpiot tomb is the historical tomb for the historical Jesus, it's also the name of Jesus's son. It's also the name of Jesus's brother, his younger brother. So his brother, his father, and his son all named Judah. So, of course, when the New Testament rewrites the story, what do you call the villain? Judah. Only the Greco-Roman way of saying it is Judas.
So this is an inside joke, so to speak. Not really, because it wasn't really a joke.
It's a jab.
It's a jab. So calling the person who gets Jesus killed is this Judas.
Right.
It's almost like a either you can say that that's a hit on Judah as the nation. You could say that's a hit on his own family is the reason that he's being crucified. Like, let's blame us. That's pretty intense.
Yes, and when you look at how Mark, the first gospel, portrayed Jesus' family, keeping in mind that it was Jesus' brothers who took over the lead of the Jesus movement when Jesus died. From 30 CE to 62 CE, 32 years. James was the leader of the church after Jesus. 32 years, the key important years of the development of that organization. And yet he's completely ignored in the New Testament as the leader afterwards, except for a few points in Acts where he's disputing with Paul, and we even get hints of his role there, because according to Acts, he sits on a throne, thronos, and he says, "I judge," krino, and soon as he makes his judgment, everybody else shuts up, and that's the end of the story. He judged. Done.
So, okay. You said someone's name that we have to rabbit trail to Paul, because there is so much confusion going on here. One of the people that I entertain ideas with, we call them a group of preterists. They say that the prophecies have already happened in the past, right? Because they're predicting a soon. That's right. Preteristic concept is supposed to happen soon, and they say, hey, maybe these did happen, and they may have wrote them after the fact. But regardless of whether they were actually fulfilled or not, I'm not concerned about that. I'm more looking at this as Paul comes on a total different mission. Now, they were trying to make sense of this text, and I kind of want your thoughts as we go into Paul, because I don't want to deter you from what you know about Paul and what our audience needs to hear. But the Gentiles that we're seeing here, they have an idea that they suppose the Gentiles that Paul is after are actually scattered diaspora that are non-Torah Orthodox, that are just like, they're paganized Israelites that Paul's after. Now, most scholars would say these are actual pagans and not actual Israelites that are like Samaritans and such that are, they've gone pagan, but they are Israelites, so to speak. What are your thoughts? Does it even matter at the end of the day to you?
Well, there was such a hodgepodge after James. Well, first of all, let's back up. After Jesus died, James took over, and Paul infiltrated the movement. He wasn't welcome. He wasn't accepted. They wanted him dead. Acts 9 talks about the disciples of Jesus, and then it goes on to say the disciples in Damascus, and then it says the Jews in Damascus, and then it says the Jews, and they just progressively fog the idea that the people who are out to kill Paul, literally kill him, want him dead, were Jesus's loyal followers, who are working on behalf of the interests of their group. That's how much they hated Paul. Now, Paul deserved it. If you read, they've recovered some of the markers from around the temple area from the first century temple. The second temple had a marker on every pillar around the court of the Gentiles. These pillars separated the court of the Jews from the court of the Gentiles. And these pillars, one of them had the sign in Greek, the next pillar had the sign in Latin, so no Gentile had any excuse for going beyond these pillars. They said that you would be killed if you went beyond this point. If you go into the sacred area, you will be dead, and dead that day. There'll be no trial, no nothing, and no first offense leniency, no excuse that it was an accident. You go beyond this, you're dead. If anybody tries to protect you against you being dead, they will be dead too, no matter who they are. Yeah. So that's on the signs. So the Gentiles knew better than to do this. And here we have stories in the New Testament of Paul taking Timothy, who was part Gentile, if not all Gentile, around the temple. And other Jews saying, look, this guy's got to die. And then the Romans show up with hundreds of horses and hundreds of men, protection that would be fitting an aristocrat. what was going on, why Paul was getting all this special protection.
I'm losing you. You're getting quieter, like you're backing up.
Okay, well, basically, Paul had a lot of protection from the Romans, and he had a lot of hatred from the Jews. For someone who is supposedly the apostle par excellence, this doesn't make sense if he's legitimate. Paul was hated by the original followers, and Paul matches the description in the Dead Sea Scrolls of a person that the Dead Sea Scrolls called the liar. Now, this liar or scoffer, he was said to have been once a part of the movement for a short time. Paul was part of the early Christian movement for a short time. He was said to have left the movement. Well, Paul left that movement. He was said to have then gone around preaching a gospel that talked about a Eucharist that was poured, and they called him the pourer of lies for this. And Paul did run around having a mystery Eucharist that was poured. Then they said that this liar opposed the law of Moses. Well, we know that Paul opposed the law of Moses. The whole idea, Hagar or the slave woman, it's all cast out. It's ancient. Paul's whole theology gets rid of all the reasons for any distinctiveness for Judaism, and the Jews did not accept it. So
I don't blame them.
Dead for that. Yeah. So Paul definitely said that the law of Moses was done, and then the Dead Sea Scrolls say that this guy went around raising up congregations. Now, who else will fit all 5 of those like Paul? Nobody. I mean, it just absolutely fits. And then when you know that Paul comes into this as a relative of the Herodian dynasty, he says in Romans 16, say hello to my relative Herodian. He's got a relative named Herodian. There's possible Acts has one passage that hints that he may have been raised with Herod the Tetrarch. Paul's a Roman citizen, according to Acts 22, I believe. And a Roman citizen.
Look at Romans. Was it Romans 13? Obey the law, the land that God put these Romans. I mean,
yeah.
Yeah.
And the Dead Sea Scrolls, the rule of the community says that the overseer of the community is to be obeyed because he was put in place by God. Paul said, no, Caesar's to be obeyed because he was put in place by God.
Ooh.
Completely opposite. Yeah.
So Paul, okay, let me get this straight. Paul is obviously, in my opinion, I guess my motivational factor in this, in my opinion, is that Paul's he's purposely trying to break this or defeat without necessarily swords at this moment.
Right.
He's trying to defeat a movement, an ideological movement. Do you think
counterintelligence?
That's what I was wondering. Do you think the motivation on Paul's side and the Herodian side was, I mean, I know that it seems like it depends on how you look at this coin. Do you think his motivations were trying to save Israel from annihilation because the prophecies were heading to a dead end? I mean, look at what they were planning on doing with Rome. Look at Rome. I mean, they are not to be messed with. You know what I mean?
Right. They are not to be messed with, and Paul knew their power. And Josephus and Paul both appreciated the power of Rome and thought that you want to get on the winning side on this equation. And so they jumped ship from the Jewish side to the winning side. In fact, Josephus, when talking about the Jews in one part of his writings, he says their country and their laws. And this is a Jew talking about Jewish laws and calling it their country, their laws. He's obviously taken a stance that he's not part of that group in his own mind, the way he speaks. And it makes sense. I don't know if you know the story, the details of commonality between Paul and Josephus, but I'll give you 13 disturbing similarities between Josephus and
Please do.
Okay. Both had a Herodian connection. Paul had a relative named Herodian. Like Herod, Josephus had 3 wives, including a foreigner, 2 divorces, and spent his final years as a very well-paid Roman-appointed governor of Galilee. Both had Roman citizenship. Now, this is really key because citizenship in Rome is not like citizenship today. You're born in Canada, you're Canadian. You're born in the USA, you're an American. Yeah, and you got citizenship. You're born in Rome, you haven't got Roman citizenship. You're born in Rome, but you're not a Roman. You're Italian or whatever nationality your parents were, whatever, but you're not a Roman. To be a Roman citizen, you had to grow up into an adult, then join the Roman military, survive 25 years. Then you're a Roman citizen. Otherwise, the emperor had to appoint you a Roman citizen, or you had to buy it if you knew the right people and had sufficient money, roughly $100 million in our money will buy you Roman citizenship. Or you were part of a family that was so snugly close with the emperor's own family for so many generations that the emperors decided your whole family has automatic citizenship by birth, the only ones in all of Rome that have it. And that's the type of citizenship that Paul had.
It begs the question, you think that was the one, right? The one that he was snugly close to the royalty of Rome?
Absolutely.
And he mentions that, doesn't he, in one of his letters?
Paul came from Tarsus. Tarsus was a city where Roman emperors kept their families, and they also had a large population of Benjaminites. Benjaminites were the group that were used by the Romans to infiltrate Judea. Benjaminites were the other half of the southern kingdom of Israel, which comprised the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin. But the whole place was just called Judea. This is after the breakup of the south and north kingdom. The northern kingdom Israel had 10 tribes. They got assimilated into Babylon, disappeared from history that way. But the two tribes, Benjamin and Judah, kept their distinctiveness into Roman times. And Paul did not want to be called a Jew. He hated that. He did not want to be associated with Judea or Jews. He called himself a Hebrew or an Israelite, anything but Jew. He hated that name. And Paul was named after the first king of Israel, who was also a Benjaminite. The very first king of Israel was King Saul, Paul's name before he changed it to Paul. So he's named after the very first Benjaminite king. He's related to the Herods, who also were all Benjaminites, and the Herodian groups were all celebrating that the royal line of rule had been restored to the Benjaminite clan. That had been a grudge for the Benjaminites against the Judeans for centuries. When King Saul was replaced, it wasn't by his son, it was by David from the line of Judah. And then they called the kingdom of Judea, leaving out Benjamin. The Benjaminite tribe was being bullied. Then they consolidated their grip on power by starting off a myth that the predicted Messiah would come from the line of David. And so they always had to have a Davidic king in the throne. If you ever want to see the Messiah, keep the Judeans in the throne. Well, just imagine how the Benjaminites, who had the kingdom first, thought about that. So that's why the Romans, they were disgruntled, and the Romans used them as spies. So Paul's named after the first king of Israel, who was a Benjaminite. He lives in Tarsus, the main concentration where Benjaminites lived. So both parts of Paul of Tarsus was screaming, I'm a Benjaminite. You might as well just know that I'm a spy for the Romans, and I'm one of those guys. But,
he wrote in Philippians 4:22, and all the rest of God's people send you greetings, to especially those of Caesar's household.
Exactly. And in fact, Paul said that there were saints in Caesar's household, and he knew all these. He hobnobbed with Felix and Agrippa. He hung out with Epaphroditus. Now, Epaphroditus was a common name, and Paul may have known more than one Epaphroditus. But apparently, this Roman slave Epaphroditus was a servant for Rome, and was if it's the same guy, this guy was the personal secretary for Nero, and then the personal secretary for Domitian after Nero passed. He was also the publisher of Josephus's writings. Now, some scholars, like Paul Mayer, have suggested that there was a common editor of Josephus's writings and Paul's writings, because there are passages in the writings that seem very, very similar. They use the same Attic Greek. They have the same very unusual idiosyncrasies in the grammar, and they have a distinctive vocabulary that is improbable by chance. And so they were suggesting, scholars have suggested, there's been Christian impact on these writings. And of course, everybody's always known that Christian editing of Josephus's writings had to occur somewhere along the line, because in the
Right.
Testimonium, you got that 4th century concern whether it's lawful to call Jesus a man, as if anybody cared about that kind of issue.
Right. That graduated over time, that deification to that kind of magnitude. That's not something
Exactly.
that was right there at the beginning. Right.
Right. And then when Mark rewrote the story, he changed it all so that he insulted the Jesus's family. Like we mentioned, Jesus's brothers took over. James took over after Jesus, and then Simon took over after James, and then Judah took over after Simon. The church fathers, Eusebius, Epiphanius, and all that, give us these details. So and Hegesippus. So we know that Jesus's family was very important. James Tabor has made a very excellent case with his book, The Jesus Dynasty. I highly recommend his work. And where did I go with that?
The family in Mark, I think you're saying
Yeah,
was.
that's right. The family is put down in Mark. All of a sudden, you're talking about, hey, Jesus, your family, your brothers are outside, waiting to talk to you. And Jesus says, they're my family? What? No, listen, you guys are more my family than they're my family. And then you have Mark saying, Jesus' family's running around apologizing for Jesus' behavior. We're sorry he's so crazy. We're going to take him home now. So the whole family is alluding that Jesus is crazy, and it's a big insult. So the whole rewrite in the New Testament is a reversal of everything.
That's exactly what Dr. Luther, my co-host, has started to see. And of course, I'm not going to go into details, but he's writing a lot of the stuff that's going to be in the book, where he's
Right.
showing a lot of the sectarian Dead Sea Scroll reversal of stuff. Paul knew this literature. That's the point. Right. So whoever this author is, regardless of who you think Paul is, whether you want to say Simon Magus, I don't care. Even though I know what your position is, and you also connect, like one of our previous people, who Paul is from Josephus, if I'm not mistaken, right. Yeah. in one of his writings.
Yes, that's true. The Josephus mentions, not mentioning Paul by name, but mentioning a Jewish teacher who advises Queen Helen of Agaba, or Antioch, the other name for it, that she shouldn't believe in circumcision. It's not necessary, and that's a typical Pauline idea. You read Galatians and Colossians, you're going to get the whole anti-law, anti-circumcision thing, and no need to worry about your kosher diet anymore. Paul was taking completely opposite position to that which was enforced upon him by James, according to Acts, and the very fact that Paul lied about what his mission was about when he was brought before James, according to the book of Acts. James made the key issue was everybody wants to know whether or not you still respect the law, the Torah. Are you a Torah observer or are you not? Yes or no, Paul. No means we're going to kill you here. Which is it? So Paul says, well, Paul says, well, I don't have to think about this. I'm just going to say, oh, yes, I believe in that. So James says, well, then good. Here's an expensive ritual. We want you to go and pay for the sacrifices for these people who are all doing vows, and they want to clean up their act. And we want you to participate in this to prove to everybody that you're a super strict Jew, that you don't believe the Torah is gone. And what does Paul do? He complies. Well, that's a complete denial of everything he wrote in his letters in all of his epistles to his churches. All his pastoral epistles can be just tossed out. Paul obviously didn't believe it himself. If your life comes on the line, don't expect Jesus to save you. Don't expect anything else. Just lie and say, I don't buy into that nonsense anymore, because that's Paul's view of it when it comes down. But anyways, let's continue. 13 disturbing things between Josephus and Paul. Both changed their allegiance. Paul was an agent for the Roman appointed Judean high priesthood. Then he was, and by the way, while we're talking about just a snippet on that, he was given a warrant from the high priest to go and get those disciples who were called followers of the way, and he was going to find them in Damascus. Now, when we realize that the high priest only had authority in Judea, he couldn't give a warrant for any other place outside Judea. We have to look for this Damascus in Judea. There were more than one place named Damascus. Which Damascus are we talking about? Well, apparently it was in Judea. Eisenman has just come up with this uncovery of an archaeological site in Judea that seems to be part of James' path away from the Romans, and where he has evidence that James stayed in Qumran for a while. I have attached a video on one of my papers online. I'll make sure you get a copy of that link. Anyway,
you there?
Paul was going to Damascus, and it turns out that Damascus was the name of the settlement in the Judean wilderness for the Qumran sect. That what we call Qumran, they called Damascus. So now Paul's journey to Damascus, his whole idea, where was he converted? And Acts 9 says this was the home of disciples. That links it again to Qumran. Anyways, Paul was an agent for the Roman appointed high priesthood. Then he was allegedly a convert to the anti-Roman Nazarene group at Damascus or Qumran, although it is more likely that Paul was just one of many Roman spies, since he never renounced his citizenship. He only stayed briefly. He left under hostile circumstances, and he was provided with Roman protection befitting that of an aristocrat. Josephus changed his allegiance from being a loyal commander of Galilean Zealot forces to becoming a useful human encyclopedia Judaica for his new Roman masters. Both avoided death by recanting everything for which they stood. Paul raised up congregations and wrote them letters with a repeated emphasis on the message that the laws of Moses, so greatly revered at Qumran, were all abolished. He lived like a Gentile among the Gentiles. Paul did a flip-flop when he called before James the Just. When Paul's life was on the line, Paul renounced his faith in the gospel message. Josephus at Jotapata was even more grossly obsequious. Josephus was siding with the Zealots at a time when the Romans forced their retreat into a cave with no other exit. In a devout pact of suicide, like the one that was made at Masada, these defeated freedom fighters each assisted their fellow to find their final dignity. They cut each other's throats. Josephus cleverly convinced them of the dignity of this dying duty and artfully arranged to be the final holder of the blade. At that point, he surrendered to the Romans and then dutifully assisted them in their lethal campaign throughout Judea against his other countrymen. How do you trust a slime like that? Anyway.
Yeah, no, I get it. And it does. I mean, it's taken me years, Christopher, it's taken me years to even look at Paul like this. And Paul, right. If you were talking about a detective show, this is the guy right under your nose the whole time that is doing something. And this is why I've been confused about really putting my hands on anything and saying, oh, I'm very skeptical, and rightfully so. I should be. I entertain ideas as if I believe them because I want to absorb them, but I change to new ideas when evidence comes. Paul's up to something. Whoever the hell he is, he's up to no good, at least in the perception if you're looking at it from the Torah Orthodox Jewish side. But if you look at it from the political side, if we were America back then, we would be infiltrating a movement just like that, trying to, and we've done it even in modern times.
Absolutely. Absolutely right.
Yeah, with these terrorist sects, we've sent undercover agents in to try and infiltrate, and some of them have been caught and killed. So yes.
And for all the people that say, well, Paul couldn't be that bad, Paul admitted he was a murderer. He admitted that he went fanatical in his murdering and that he did it for a long time and got all kinds of victims. So that he has that in common with Josephus. Josephus killed all those guys in Jotapata, the cave there. And Paul admitted to slaying an unknown number of Jesus' followers throughout Judea. Another commonality they have is both of them changed their names. Joseph ben Mattiyahu became Titus Flavius, and then Flavius Josephus. And Saulus became Paul. Both were friends with Epaphroditus. Both were friends with Roman nobility. Both were appointed to impressive positions regarding Judean governmental administration. Paul's warrant from the high priest identified his target, but Paul had to have had Roman authorization because Paul had a license to kill, and the Jews did not have such a license. So that tells you something very significant too. You couldn't run around in a Roman province killing people and get away with it without Roman authorization. So that's a very big step that people just blithely ignore, in their willingness to believe anything that sounds like a nice spiritual story that they want to believe. The real story was a context of war. You started out this show by mentioning that, and I was glad because that's an important concept. Everything about this whole thing is in the context of a looming war and a political battle. So who's the king? The very, very vital thing. So Jesus was the leader of the resistance as the oppressed heir to the throne in a nation ruled by a foreign conqueror. They had similar writings. I mentioned the Paul and Josephus using distinctive Attic Greek, etc. Both manipulated well-known prophecies of the Old Testament for their own purposes. Paul modified the Old Testament prophesied Hebrew world king, the Messiah, into a Greco-Romanized Savior God, the Christ, using the authority of his personal revelation to discard any obligations to Jewish laws or tradition. Josephus also advocated the Hellenization of Judaism. Josephus applied the Balaam prophecy, Numbers 24, to Vespasian. When Vespasian became emperor, he treated Josephus as if he were a prophet, eventually appointing him a governor. Both came from rich aristocratic families with vested interests in maintaining the status quo, and both took liberties when it came to the way that they represented their passionate opponents. Eisenman quotes, a quote from Eisenman, quote, Josephus rarely gives the entire picture where insurgent groups are at issue. So that's an important concept. And Paul, of course, ranted against James. When you talk about Paul's rants, you can use the New Testament for Paul's rants and find all kinds of stuff on Paul that doesn't make Paul look that good.
Yeah, and it definitely pits them against one another. You can tell. I mean, Galatians, Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, talking about the super apostles. I mean, he's trash talking these guys big time, man, and that's what I've been recognizing. So is there any peer-reviewed publications on some of this material to kind of convey this, or?
Peer-reviewed material that would support this would be anything by Eisenman, anything by SDF Brandon is very, very supportive of this. I recommend them with great passion and enthusiasm.
Doesn't he only have one publication, though, that's written and translated into English?
Who's that?
SGF Brandon?
No. He's got.
I must have someone else mixed up. Oh, that's Bauer.
He's got Jesus and the Zealots, and he's got the one about the Jerusalem church. I'll go grab the book to give you the right title. Give me 2 seconds. You can talk to the guy.
No problem. I definitely enjoy this. This is informative. Very informative. Very, very informative. Ladies and gentlemen, obviously you're going to want to get the PDFs that he has because he's already written some stuff. And I'll make sure you guys have access to that so we can help support what he's doing. I think he's actually going to be selling the PDF form. So if you want to get a copy of it, I'll make sure that you can get a hold of his PayPal. And all you got to do when you send the money is put your email so that he can send over the PDF to you in a comment box. Now, are you back, Christopher?
I'm back. Yes.
Okay. What are you gonna for your PDFs? Because you've got some great information that's been written, and I know that we talked about the PayPal thing. What is the cost? What do you recommend?
You know what? Give me whatever you think it's worth to you for this information. I'm not going to put a specific price. I don't. If you have to only put in $1 and that's all you want to do, that's fine. If you want to put in $20 to help me out and encourage me, that'd be great. Whatever you want to do.
Okay.
I don't want to have anybody limited from getting the information.
Yeah, and if you send it over and you're having complications, We'll make sure we have a PayPal for him. But if you send it over, get up with me. I'm easy to get a hold of on Facebook. You can email me. I'll put my email down here in the comment section, and I'll make sure to get up with him so I can get you your PDF, and we'll make sure you get it. But we want to help you out for all this work. Did you go over all the parallels between Josephus and Paul?
Yes, I basically covered them.
Okay.
And Brandon's other book is called The Fall of Jerusalem and the Christian Church, a study of the effects of the Jewish overthrow of 80-70 on Christianity. Very excellent book. So I recommend both of them. If you want to compare what Paul says, comparing himself to the other disciples, we can put it in synopsis form here. Just in a couple paragraphs here. Paul was amazing. Paul was extraordinary. If you doubt it, just ask Paul. Jewish scholars and original disciples would have agreed that the references in the book of Isaiah concerning a light to the Gentiles, Isaiah 42, were meant to describe the Jewish Messiah, Acts 26. Paul tells us this was really a reference to himself, Acts 13, Galatians 1, Ephesians 3. Paul claimed that he was called to be an apostle from the time he was in his mother's womb, Galatians 1. In other words, Paul claimed he was in fact the very first apostle. Am I not an apostle? 1 Corinthians 9:1. Even though I may not be an apostle to others, surely I am to you, 1 Corinthians 9:2. It's obvious that this was a serious issue for Paul in his day. After the death of Judas, a replacement was chosen to qualify as a potential new apostle. The other original apostles decided a candidate had to have been, quote, with us the whole time, beginning from John's baptism to the time when Jesus was taken up from us, Acts 1, 21, 22. Paul was not chosen. In actual fact, Paul did not even qualify to be a possible candidate. Paul said the people known as, quote, the apostles of Christ were actually, quote, false apostles in disguise. 2 Corinthians 11, 13 to 15. Paul describes circumcision as mutilation, Philippians 3. Paul rants, I wish they would go the whole way and emasculate themselves, Galatians 6. Paul labels James, Peter, and John as men who were, quote, reputed to be pillars, Galatians 2. They, quote, seemed to be leaders, Galatians 2. They were those who seemed to be important. Whatever they were makes no difference to me. Those men added nothing, Galatians 2. Are they servants of Christ? I'm out of my mind to talk like this. I'm more, 2 Corinthians 11. Paul claims his summons to Jerusalem was to inform James and others of his mission to the Gentiles. Paul boasted to his Galatian friends he, quote, did not give in to them for a moment, end quote, Galatians 2, 1 to 10. Elsewhere, Paul admits that he did give in to performing Jewish ritual, 1 Corinthians 9, 20. The details concerning these events found in Acts 21, 20 to 26 make it a clear historical fact that Paul was a liar. Paul lied to James about the message he preached and then lied about submitting to James. Yeah, so, and then Paul repeatedly says in his writings at least 3 different places, he says, I am not lying. It seems that somebody had been calling Paul a liar on a regular basis, and the Dead Sea Scrolls do have their key sectarian opponent sounds exactly like Paul, and they call him the liar. And then, but did Paul know these guys? Apparently he did, because Paul testified to us in 1 Corinthians 13, that famous passage about love, that if I have all knowledge and I speak with the languages of men and angels and understand all mysteries, if I don't have love, I'm nothing. But it sounds like Paul is insulting the overseer of the Dead Sea sect, because the Dead Sea sect said that this overseer, to be the overseer, to be qualified to become the overseer, you had to be a master of all the mysteries and a master of all the languages of men. What an extraordinary requirement. They had to master all the main languages they were exposed to, and they had to be a master of all the mysteries. Yeah. And then they said they knew the angels by name, so that matches the angels part of it. It seems like Paul's talking about the Dead Sea Scroll overseer. There's nobody else that matches that description.
No, so many red flags also come up. Like it just makes me want to once again relook at the gospel narrative in light of this, because you have Jesus calling these Pharisees brood of vipers, right? Your father was a liar from the beginning. Right. Now we know this narrative, according to scholarship, comes later. It's almost as if it's written after Paul. Is
Right.
there something like a reference to the liar here that is dealing with Paul, or is this been covered up, or is this really some metaphysical kind of concept of Satan that they're trying to pull from and blame these Jews for? The Romans are kind of trying to make the fault fall on the Jews in this situation. You see where I'm going with that? Like
Yeah, I do. Well, we mentioned earlier how the first gospel, Mark, had taken the family of Jesus and made fun of them, how they took the name of Jesus' most likely historical father, Judah, and the name of his son, the name of his brother, and made it the name of a villain. Jesus was apparently married to Miriam of Magdala, and his mother's name was Maria, an unusual name for a Hebrew woman. It's a common name in the form of Miriam, but not so common with a hey on the end instead of a name. Yeah, so this name Mary, which applied to both Jesus's mother and Jesus's wife, became the name of a prostitute in the New Testament. So again, more denigration of everything. You can see it's a consistent pattern.
I love this. What you've just done has just opened my mind up more to new ideas. Christopher, how do they get a hold of you, and what do we need? I mean, I'm going to be putting your link in the description because we've got to do more shows with you. I really appreciate this information. We can go deeper. And I've already looked at some of this stuff, guys, and I'm going to tell you right now, there's a lot of source material he's put in here. There's references to the source material, and he's all over the place with a lot of this content. I love what you're doing here. How do people help you? Like, where do they go? How can they contact you? If you give any contact information?
Well, you can friend me on Facebook. You can contact me by email, potpoetry@hotmail.com. That's POETRY @hotmail.com. Pot poetry, all one word, @hotmail.com.
Okay.
And we can go from there. I don't know how they do the PayPal thing, so
we'll set it up.
You set all that up. I appreciate that.
Absolutely. And then, by the way, guys, if you want the PDF, I don't mind being the middleman. That way, you guys have my PayPal down here, and I can send him the PayPal money, and you guys can get a copy of how many different PDFs do you have that are like written long PDF formats?
Well, the one that has all the major material is called Reconstructing Jesus. And that's the one that you want to do your real homework with. But I have a couple of smaller PDFs that you can just have for free. That the mythology, one of them is called Why Paul's Mythologization of the Jesus Story Was Political. Another one was Respectfully Reconstructing King Jesus, based on the study of the first century Dead Sea Scrolls. Basically, these are, I've snipped out stuff from my Reconstructing Jesus and pasted it together there. Reconstructing Jesus includes more than just this theological battle of the Dead Sea Scroll community and Paul. It includes the story of Jesus' brothers and their role. It includes the role of Jesus' healing techniques. I put in a little bit of information on some of the evidence for other entheogens from other sources that.
Yeah, you've got a lot of information. So what I'll do is you guys send me a donation to Christopher Lawson, and what I'll do is I'll be the middleman and make sure to email you these PDF formats so that you have the content. All you got to do when you go down to the description, go to the PayPal. You can just send it to Derek, and then what you'll do is put under the comments section your email, and I want Christopher Lawson's PDF. And whatever the amount is, and I'll make sure that you get all those funds. Well, thanks for joining me, man.
My pleasure.
This has been a very educational. I really enjoy this, and Myth Vision wants to keep bringing you this content. So look, if you like what your host is doing here and you like what the show's doing, feel free to like, subscribe, and also any coins you guys give us in the PayPal, we try to use those to try and better the show and keep bringing you the best. Thanks for tuning in. Be sure to subscribe. And hey, until next time, you never know when we'll drop another nugget. All right, y'all. Myth Vision.